Welcome to the last day of the UMMAA 100 conference. Those of you who are here on Sunday morning, it's great to see you here on Sunday morning. I'm looking forward to the session this morning, which will be led by our own Dr. Brian Stewart. Brian, regardless of what the program says, is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the department, and he is our Curator of African Archaeology in UMMAA. So with that, his session is titled Social Networks and Information Flow, Evolutionary Perspectives.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to try to not overly mic myself. First, there's an announcement, which is somebody told me that these are not my glasses. They're somebody else's glasses. Are these anyone's glasses? No. Okay, there's nobody here. That's probably why. First, I just wanted to say that this has been such a fun conference, and we were having lunch yesterday with Bob Whalen, and we were just saying the legacy that they built and that they left for us is so strong, and it's such a delight to be able to carry this forward and to grow. And I think over the last couple days we've really seen a reorientation and a building on previous sort of infrastructure of this institution that is really, really promising for the future. With that said, I will launch into my opening spiel. The session is Social Networks and Information Flow, Evolutionary Perspectives. And as is clear from how many times over the last couple days we've heard how nice it is to be in person again, humans are quintessentially, intensely, riotously social beings. The latter, unfortunately, sometimes in the literal sense. The number, quality, and magnitude of relationships that we create through our lives are strongly linked to mental, physical, and reproductive health. That's been scientifically quite well established. This, together with numerous other significant correlations, for instance, between group and neocortical size of the brain, in humans and non-human primates, suggest a strong biocultural, evolutionary, selective basis for enhanced social networks. 2 days ago, we were reminded by Dietrich Stout that unilinear evolutionary trajectories are something of a fallacy, and that our global dominance as a species was not inevitable, nor was it necessarily fitness enhancing if we end up constructing a polluted and artificially warmed niche for ourselves that is ultimately uninhabitable. Hopefully that's not the route we're going to go down. But just as it's hard to argue against the evolutionary success suggested by the existence of 8 billion people alive today, so it's difficult to deny that Homo sapiens, our species, has taken social networking to dizzying heights, managing today to interlink a large proportion of that 8 billion people through digitally platformed information channels that can do anything from rapidly crowdsource for someone who lost their home to unravel whole political regimes. Following up on the seminal work by UMMAA scholars, most notably Bob Whalen, who's here, and others like Martin Wobst, Polly Wiesner, Michael Joachim, Leah Mink, and our session participant Ben Fitzhugh, along with others, a raft of recent evolutionary anthropology studies have emphasized just how vital social networks and their structural variability are to the form and adaptive trajectories of small-scale societies. Indeed, these studies are even questioning whether societies traditionally considered small-scale, quote-unquote, such as hunter-gatherers and most pastoralists, should indeed be conceived as such, given that their multi-level social structures tend to be highly efficiently organized into so-called small worlds, wherein access to network-wide resources and information are never more than a few social contacts away. Friendships, the most important word is friendships, with a small number of non-kin individuals within and beyond one's group fundamentally transforms network structures and enhances their efficiency, changing them from overly clustered or evenly distributed networks to the intermediate sweet spot offered by small worlds, in which well-placed contacts open up access to a wealth of resources, information, and or mates. Such relationships start early in childhood and are reified, built upon, and maintained by mechanisms of mobility, fission, fusion, and exchange. As UMMAA researchers have long recognized, spatially extended networks linking friends living in diverse and complementary ecologies serve as buffering mechanisms that reduce risk through ensuring reciprocal access to foraging territories and information during times of resource shortfall. But it also now seems that extended social networks beyond kin allow for and created the selective milieu in which Homo sapiens' extraordinary degree of cumulative culture evolved. This is the so-called ratchet effect of human culture that was mentioned a couple days ago by Mindy Zader, the phenomenon whereby human intelligence is distributed across many minds, creating cultures whose richness, detail, and evolutionary potential are only accessible and maintainable with spatially extended social networks, creating what Andrea Miliano and colleagues have called a network memory, or what another of our speakers, Marcus Hamilton, has called, quote, decentralized knowledge systems characteristic of hunter-gatherer societies. However, knowledge is unevenly distributed across networks. That's also very crucial, due to variability in network structure, and thus unevenly transmitted across generations. This leads to network-based differences in cultural forms, resilience, and complexity. Articulating with Raven Garvey's session, this gives variability in social networks a direct bearing on cultural evolution. And indeed, there have even been recent calls by colleagues, Marcus Hamilton among them, to imbue cultural evolution with so-called network thinking, capable of illuminating macroevolutionary trends in the archaeological record. At the same time, as touched upon yesterday by Lindsay Montgomery, ontological insights born of new animist approaches show that human social networks are extended to such an extent as to stretch beyond biologically living societies to supernatural agents in the form of animal, landform, and human spirits. Such relationships, too, have clear archaeological signatures, and that's part of the subject of a book that I have coming out, and important implications for understanding site and assemblage formation. And here we have much, or probably most, to learn from our indigenous colleagues. This session explores current thinking about multidimensional social networks in small-scale societies and current methods archaeologists can use in their reconstruction. So, with that, let's go to the first speaker. I will introduce him as soon as I find the appropriate. Oh no, that's literally just did that, didn't I? Okay. Da, da, da. Okay. Oh God, I'm a Mac user. Where's the view and then full screen? Where is it? Okay, there we go. Okay, groovy. So our first speaker is Marcus Hamilton, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He received both his master's and PhD from the University of New Mexico before undertaking postdoctoral fellowships there and at the Santa Fe Institute, and I think at the University of Missouri, if I'm not mistaken. His research focuses on quantitative interdisciplinary approaches to the evolution of human ecology and social organization. He's particularly interested in the ecology and archaeology of hunter-gatherer societies and the evolution of human biological and cultural diversity. He notes that at all scales, from egalitarian hunter-gatherers to industrialized nation states, humans form complex, modular, hierarchical social networks that facilitate flows of energy and information among individuals and groups. Moreover, these networks mediate all interactions with our environment. His research goal is to develop quantitative theory that provides a mechanistic understanding of the evolution of the complex human ecological niche over time and space. In his complex systems research, he uses theory and techniques from theoretical ecology, statistical physics, and evolutionary anthropology in combination with interdisciplinary data sets. His archaeological research focuses on hunter-gatherer archaeology and the Paleo-Indian period of North America, and his talk is entitled The Macroecology of Complex Social Networks and Ethnohistoric Hunter-Gatherers. Thanks.
All right, is this thing on? Excellent, well, thanks for that introduction. It sounded really good. It's a very good summary. That's better than I could do. So thanks very much for the invite. This sort of long weekend has been absolutely fantastic. From a personal level, it's hard to overstate the importance of Michigan anthropology in my way of thinking about anthropology and archaeology, what I do on a day-to-day basis, and what archaeology means to me. So I remember very clearly when I started to develop, a serious interest in archaeology as a teenager in London. I was naturally drawn towards questions, not really of material culture, but really about how people made a living. And looking into what kind of archaeology was that, who did that kind of thing, found out quickly, yeah, that's anthropological archaeology. It's Kent Flannery, it's Lou Binford, and it's Bob Whalen, and it's there's a whole slew of people, obviously based here at the university and the museum. So to be invited to talk at its centennial celebrations is fantastic. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the macroecology of complex social networks and hunter-gatherers. This is something I've been interested in for a long time, since graduate school. And I want to say, to begin with, that the underlying theme of my entire approach here, this macroecological complex systems approach, to me is just a natural offshoot of anthropological archaeology. It's a particular sort of mathematical, computational, statistical way of addressing some of the traditional questions that structure anthropological archaeology. Okay, so my first foray into field archaeology was in West Texas in the early 90s, and how a teenager from London ends up working for 4 months and then the next 8 years in West Texas is another story. But I fell in love with these landscapes immediately. I absolutely love this part of the world, and I fell in love with the archaeology out here too. And again, the question that really interested me here again was not so much the material culture, the artifacts, as cool as they were. It was about how you made a living on a landscape like this. And not only how do you make a living, but how do you make a successful living and multiple generations of raising kids to sexual maturity and having their own families, etc., and how you could use the archaeological record to try and measure and understand this kind of process. And underlying all of this is obviously ecology and human interactions with the environment. But a key part of this is obviously social organization, how you set yourself up to interact with environments like this in order to be successful. And so this has been an underlying theme of my thinking for a long time. And of course, this is directly relevant to us today. This happens to be Manhattan, but it could be, any of the urban spaces that most of the human species live in today. And all this is a massive infrastructure of a very complex social network of hierarchical modular units. So there's this common theme, as Brian was alluding to in my work, that is trying to understand this sort of fundamental nature of human social organization, which forms these hierarchical social networks. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to break this talk into 3 sections. I'm going to talk about epistemology and inference. Everybody loves epistemology and everybody loves inference, right? Especially on a Sunday morning. But it's something that's really important to me, and it gets more and more important for various reasons. How we build knowledge about what we think we're interested in is really important. And the inference part of it, how we build statistical inference about those things that we think we are interested in, right? I'm then going to talk about the specifics of setting up a macroecological baseline to this epistemology. And then we'll talk about hunter-gatherer social networks, both in terms of the structure of those networks, which are very important, but also the size of networks, which is also very important. Okay, so let's talk about epistemology and inference to begin with. So in kind of a facetious way, my brief history of theory and anthropological archaeology consists of 2 things. There is an unobservable archaeological world that we're all interested in some way of understanding. And then there's an observable anthropological world that we have access to, that we can measure, we can observe, we can get data from. And as long as anthropology and anthropological archaeology have existed, the debate has been, what are the interaction of these 2 things? How can one inform the other? And we've gone through a series of making simple analogies from case A to case B and case B to case A. We've gone through a series of building middle-range bridging arguments between behaviors observed in case A and how they could be observed in case B, for example. But as Henry Wright and Jerry Sabloff were alluding to on Thursday night, which seems months ago now, the state of theory in anthropology and anthropological archaeology is interesting, but it hasn't really moved on in the debate. We still debate this every day, right? When I submit papers and I review papers, people talk about this all the time. We've been talking about this for at least 60 years, right? So somehow, theory was supposed to emerge from the interaction of these 2 things. But again, in anthropology, how we define theory, what it is, what does it look like, even if you came across it, is unclear, and somehow it's supposed to sort of magically pop out between these two things. So nowadays, in my work, but then also in lots of other people's work too, there's a slightly more nuanced way to building theory, which is more along the lines of the hard and the quantitative sciences, which is, we have a cycle of data science or pattern recognition. We collect data, we do some informatics, we build that into databases, we do perform some analytics on those databases. We do this to build inference, make predictions about stuff that we're interested in, that tells us what kinds of data we should be collecting, that allows us to do more analytics, etc. And it sort of builds this Bayesian-like updating cycle. And in parallel to this, not as an offshoot, but in parallel to this, we start building theories. You start getting mechanistic insights into the flows that you're interested in. And the whole process of theorizing is this constant interaction between data and theory. One is always informing the other. Theorizing is not separate at all from data. I think as Henry Wright was saying on Thursday when it came to comparative method, it's important to recognize that the comparative method, for example, is a method. It's not theory. So the stuff that's going on here in the data science is about the method, and the theory building is what we get out of that process, but it's intrinsically intertwined with data. Okay, so now let's think about this in terms of more sort of formal approaches to one particular epistemological stance, which is macroecology. So macroecology was a term actually coined by a mentor of mine at University of New Mexico in the biology department, Jim Brown, who happens to be a PhD from the 1960s from Michigan. One of the undoubted prominent thinkers in theoretical ecology in the 21st century. Macroecology is essentially the application of complex system science to ecological processes, right? It's just complex system science in ecology. And so a definition of that is it's the integration of ecological processes across spatial and taxonomic scales. So it's recognizing, as people like Mindy Zita were pointing out, with things like niche construction, interactions with the environment are always nonlinear. You're looking at synthetic theories, overarching theories, and a lot of the work is often comparative. So comparing across species, for example, or in my case, comparing across cultures, but I also do a lot of comparative work across species, and we'll talk about some of that. And it's often focusing on the scale-dependent nature of the real world, which is really important, especially through currencies of energy, matter, and information. And as Dietrich, I think, was arguing the other day, cultural information is, culture itself is not just the transfer of information, right? All that information has to be encoded into matter. That costs time and energy, and it's that whole process that somehow ends up in this thing that we call culture. We like to study, but again, we find it very hard to define. So the scale-dependent nature of the world is easy to think about. It's intuitive. We all understand it, but we need to understand it more formally, I think. So the largest scale relevant to us, we could think about the planet. Okay? So we can observe the planet, and then we can come up with observations of the anthropology of the planet, the history of the human species, the evolutionary history of the hominin clade, primates, mammals, etc. So there is a meaningful scale at which we could address questions at this scale. We could then zoom in to particular regions, and we could talk about the colonization history of these regions. We could talk about particular characteristics of topology, for example, or topography, and how that shaped the formation of settlement patterns. And we can zoom in to particular regions at finer and finer scales, ultimately to human settlements, focusing in on individuals, looking at life history, demography, etc., individual behavior, spiritual belief systems, mythological systems, etc. And of course, nowadays we can zoom in at a finer scale and we can talk about the genetic structure of populations, genomics, we can talk about parasitology, we can talk about metabolic processes, etc. We all know this, but as anthropologists, we're observing at all different scales these systems that are relevant to us. And the key in macroecology is trying to understand all of these systems are integrated. What's the underlying theory that allows you to zoom in and zoom out? Because the theories and the explanations we give of these systems are dependent on the scale at which we observe them, right? So it means I can develop meaningful theory about latitudinal gradients in biogeography of human cultures, or about the life history of individuals in some particular group. Those two things are not separate, but they need to be integrated at some level, and that's essentially what macroecology is seeking to do. So a larger epistemology of complex systems in general recognizes, life is a complex system by definition. All complex systems are scale dependent, and they can be observed at all different scales, all of which are meaningful. That means, by definition, explanation and therefore theory is also scale dependent. And this is something we often forget in anthropology and archaeology, but in science in general, is that there isn't just necessarily a single central theory to things. That theory is dependent on the scale at which you're observing or studying that system. So that means that successful theories of complex systems are those theories that integrate across those scales, that allow you to move across those scales. So a physicist might call this coarse graining. As I zoom out and I zoom back in, what remains the same when I move across those different scales? The same idea of renormalization, right? As I renormalize across these scales, what's the underlying symmetry that remains intact as I do that? And that's where real theory lies. So this leads to a very interesting observation made by Dennis Noble, who's a biologist at Oxford. And it's based on general relativity, but his notion is biological relativity. And again, I think it's something we're all intuitively aware of, but his point is that in living systems, including anthropological systems, it means that by definition, there's no privileged scale of causation. There's no one scale of causation that causes everything else. There is levels of causation at all these different scales that are integrated. And the question is, how are all those causal processes affecting one another? So this means anthropology and archaeology cannot be reductionist, right? Because there is not a level at which we can reduce everything down to and explain it. You need to understand all these different scales in order to develop meaningful theories. So in macroecology, a fundamental measure or observation is, we can look at mammals, for example, and mammals range enormously in body size, 8 orders of magnitude, which is pretty staggering if you think about that, from the smallest elephant shrews to the largest whales. And so an observation from that is that body size is very important in ecology because it sets the metabolic budget, the metabolic demand of that individual organism. So that means life history times, all kinds of biological sizes and rates are therefore scale dependent. They're dependent on the size of the organism. So that means all kinds of behavioral things about how mammals interact with the environment are also dependent on the scale, the size of that organism, because it affects it's constrained by their energetic budget. So why this is relevant to us is this is very useful because we are simply a mammal of a certain body size existing somewhere in this spectrum. We happen to be a primate, but for many reasons, that detail is not actually that important in terms of mammal ecology. But it sets a baseline expectation for making predictions of human systems based on the macroecology of things like our body size and therefore the energetic budget. So one of the key observations in macroecology is something that people may have come across before. It's called Kleiber's law. This is the simple observation that all the gray dots here are mammals, the black dots are primates, and the red dot is a human. These are on log scales. The observation is that if I find a mammal of a certain body size, I can predict its metabolic rate very closely. That is, if I take mammals and I plot them as a function or with their metabolic rate, you find this nice, tight scaling relationship. It has a particular functional form up there called a power law, and there's a whole body of literature out there explaining the importance of that particular functional form and arguing about it, but that's beyond us here. But we'll see the red dot there, humans. We humans have a basal metabolic rate which is entirely predictable for our body mass, right? So there is something very inherently predictable about our biology. The basal metabolic rate, I should say, is a flux of energy. So it's the energy that you need to flux through your system to keep yourself alive, to keep somatic maintenance going. It's measured in watts, which is a rate of joules per second. So on average, the basal metabolic rate of a human is about 80 watts. So everybody sitting here is fluxing about 80 watts, joules per second. I'm fluxing a little more than that because I'm walking around and I'm talking. But the interesting observation is that this is the energy consumption of a household light bulb. So if you give natural selection 80 watts in several million years, it can produce an organism which is capable of self-regulation, self-reproduction. It has an immune system. It can think about deep theories. Give humans 80 watts in a few years, we can develop a household light bulb. So obviously something about the efficiency of natural systems versus human systems. But what we can do is we can then embed that information, Kleiber's law, in space and start building expectations of spatial ecology. So here, for example, a key rate in spatial ecology is resource supply rate. So that is, you have to encounter space in order to gather the resources you need to fuel your metabolic rate. The rate at which you can do that is a function of your body size. And what's called the home range, that is the space that you need to encounter, is the ratio of the two. It's basically how much energy do I need, how much energy is available in the landscape. The ratio of the two in units of space is the size of an animal home range. And we can use that to make various observations. This implies the home range of mammals should be a function of their body size, and indeed it is. The larger the mammal gets, the larger its home range becomes. Blue dots here are mammals, red dots here are primates, yellow dot there is a hunter-gatherer. So hunter-gatherers have particularly large home ranges for their body size, and even large for a primate. And that's because we have very specialized diets, as was pointed out by Brian in a perspectives piece in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, I think last year. So it means we have very specialized diets. The flip side of this is this also affects population density, which is the number of individuals that could be supported per unit area. And again, the yellow dot there is hunter-gatherers. So hunter-gatherers have very low population densities for a mammal for their body size, but that's because we have very large home ranges, because we have very specialized, weird kinds of diets. But the point being is you can now see how body size across mammals starts setting this range of expectations of human ecology and hunter-gatherer ecology, and we can keep doing this for hours in all kinds of different ways. But I want to point out something we'll get back to later, which is very interesting. So if we plot the social group size of a mammal as a function of its body size here, and social group size is usually measured as the number of interactions over a 24-hour period that are non-aggressive within your species, and we plot that as a function of body size, there is not a nice tight scaling relationship here, right? It's kind of a shotgun blast. If you had to stick a slope through the middle, it'd be kind of flat. But there is this kind of interesting triangle, right? This kind of isosceles triangle. So this is governed by the fact that there are benefits to cooperation, which is causing cooperation to go up. There's also costs and competition, which are causing it to compress. So we humans, regardless of any theory or any data, just happen to be midway through that body size spectrum, and you would predict humans would have large social groups simply because of the fact we're the body size that we are. We're larger than small, but we're not too big, right? We're right in the sweet spot, which is really weird, and this is not very well understood. And we'll get back to this later, and obviously, humans do indeed have very large social groups. So let's talk about social networks, those social groups themselves. And we'll talk about the structure. So I like using Lou Binford's data for all kinds of reasons. We can argue about it, but I can defend it very well for all kinds of reasons too. But he has really interesting data on group sizes at different levels of aggregation. This is group size of co-residence groups. Traditionally, we might call them bands, for example. Just the number of individuals on a daily basis hunter-gatherers would group with. Over his data set of 339 groups, you get this nice log-normal distribution. It's kind of raggedy, but that's a sampling effect, right? There's a nice log-normal distribution here, which is a good sign. And in paper in American Antiquity, I showed this isn't just a function of Binford's data. You replicate this in Bob Kelly's work. You can replicate this in Kim Hill's data, and in data I also gathered from the literature. So a median co-residence group size in hunter-gatherer is only about 15 or 16 individuals, right? The sort of canonical dogma from Man the Hunter is about 25, right? But if you go back to Man the Hunter, that was just a number that was picked out of the air and was just kind of used because it was convenient. There was no theorizing, and nor did the people that wrote it think there was any meaning behind it. It was just a number they proposed. So the median group size is actually quite small, and this becomes important. So again, there's benefits to increasing group size, but there are increasing costs and competition which are pushing you down. If you look at the distribution of all the group sizes that Binford has, so family sizes, co-residence group sizes, aggregated phase, all the way up to what we can call metapopulations, you find these nice distributions, which on the one hand, are caused by cooperation. It's better to be large if you can pay the costs, but there are constraints. And if we can formalize this by plotting this out in box plots here, straight away you see there's a nice regularity to this plot. This is a log linear plot, right? So this linear relationship means there's an exponential relationship or a geometric series here. And so you can measure the rate at which these things are nested within each other using various techniques. And it turns out that the average branching ratio across all these groups is about 4. So 4 families tend to form a co-residence group. 4 of those form the next higher up, all the way up to these larger populations. So you have this modular hierarchical structure of networks, which is very consistent across hunter-gatherer groups. So again, this is just looking at the large-scale statistics, not looking at any variation. But interestingly, we can take all that data and we can break them out by the ecosystem they happen to operate in. Is there some function of the environment which might be affecting this? The short answer is no. If you do the same process with these groups broken out by different environments, you find that this nested structure is very, very consistent across different habitats. So there's something very intrinsic and independent of environmental variation that causes humans to form these kinds of social networks. And if we were to plot out the topology of this kind of network in space, it would look something like this, where you have these modular, nested, networked interaction, decentralized networks, which are held together by fission-fusion interaction. Obviously, all these groups are moving through space from place to place, but they form these complex, very dynamic social networks. And so this is something that I've been interested for a long time. Then Doug Bird wrote the paper with his colleagues in Journal of Human Evolution, pointing out that basically, these social networks are really complex, dynamic things. They're not small scale. They form these small worlds, which indeed they do, in a very formal way. They form these small world interactions, these modular structures to human social networks. And so finally, I just want to talk about the importance of size. So this is something I've become increasingly interested in. That is, size is very important in social networks because regardless of what we think about the intelligence of a human individual and our ability to do complex tasks, the real magic occurs when you take that ability and you plug it into a network of other people doing the same kind of thing. And there's all kinds of knock-on effects of being able to do that. And so therefore, the more people you can network together to do those tasks, you can start doing extraordinary things, much more so than any one individual could. If you plot out the data, and we don't have to go into details here, with the hunter-gatherers, what you'll find is that larger and larger networks become denser and denser. So that means in space, larger populations are actually more efficient at using the energy that's available to them. And we think that's probably because there's more and more information transfer in these larger and larger social networks embedded in space. And so that means, in a very real sense, individual energy budgets and hunter-gatherers are more efficient when they're in larger social networks. So this is really important for humans because it means in humans there's always going to be selection for larger networks if you can pay the cost, because there's all kinds of economies of scale we all benefit from by living in massive, very complicated social networks. Now there's paradox there because it means we all consume more and more energy because it's easier and easier to get. And this is called Jevons paradox, right? So there's increased efficiencies, but you have to pay the cost for that increased efficiency. And it's a paradox because there's no obvious solution to that problem. This is one of the central paradoxes of sustainability science. So finally, if we plot out the size, the maximum size of hunter-gatherer groups and the minimum size of hunter-gatherer groups, the sort of total metapopulation, these residence groups, against the mammal data and the primate data, what you find is that the largest hunter-gatherer groups are over an order of magnitude bigger than any other mammal out there, right? So hunter-gatherers are interacting in social networks which are 10 times larger than any other social network in the ecological world, in the mammalian world, which is fascinating. There's all kinds of benefits from doing that. On the other end of the scale, hunter-gatherers tend to live in social groups which are actually slightly smaller than you would expect for a mammal of our body size or a primate of our body size. And there's all kinds of reasons that this might be beneficial. But these two things, these two scales are integrated and they become essential components of the same social network. So just to wrap up, again, I started out by saying all of this kind of way of thinking about the world, and it's gone off, there's all kinds of different aspects of this kind of research, which we don't have time to talk about here, but it's all driven ultimately by anthropological archaeology, and then just this extension into this more statistical, computational, mathematical way of thinking about anthropological archaeology. And the macroecological perspective is so important because it creates this frame of reference, to use Binford's term, right? It's this frame of reference is the body size spectrum of mammals, which sets expectations. And we form large, complex social networks as a result of this. So this also begs a number of very important questions which have to be asked. This is all well and good, right? But how well can this structure be extrapolated into the past, for example? This is ethno-historic hunter-gatherer groups. It seems to be quite common, universal, and robust. But what evidence do we have that this might have existed in the past? What might the archaeological signatures of that be? And what about the tyranny of the ethnographic record, as pointed out by Martin Wobst here? Right, the sample of hunter-gatherers we have here is not an unbiased sample of any groups that ever existed. They're just the ones that made it through time that anthropologists got to witness, to record data from, with the assumption that there's enough underlying information left in those groups that we can make statistical predictions about general properties of unobserved things that we're interested in, like the archaeological record. Okay, so with that, thank you for listening. It's been a great pleasure to be here. And I'd be happy to answer any questions later on or in the panel. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Amazing. Amazing. Our next speaker is Michelle Langley, who was kind enough to travel all the way from Australia. Thank you. She is the a senior research fellow in the Australian Research Centre for Human Evolution and senior lecturer in archaeology at Griffith University. And she is also the director of the Griffith Experimental Archaeology Research Lab, which has a cool acronym, GEAR. Very cool. Her research centers around the evolution of human cognition, which she explores through the role of children and childhood in early cultural development, and the use by early humans, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthal communities of hard animal materials like bone, tooth, antler, ivory, claw, quill, shell to create technology. Her other key research foci is Australia's deep past, in particular the diverse osseous or bone tools and ornaments made by the first Australians over the last 65,000 years. She's the recipient of a 2018 Queensland Young Tall Poppy Science Award and Women in Technology Research Leader in Science finalist in 2021. She's the fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London. And her talk is entitled The Visibility and Invisibility of Social Information, Insights from Osseous Technologies and Implications for Evolutionary Narratives. Load your talk. Oh. View, no. Okay, take it away, thanks.
Thank you, Brian, especially for that kind introduction. Like Marco said, it makes us sound very good. So today I'm going to focus mostly on work I've been over the past 4 years in Indigenous Australia, and as such I'd like to note any Indigenous Australians who might be here with us or watching on the live stream that this presentation includes photographs of Aboriginal Australians who are now passed, and on one slide images of death pointers, but I do have a warning if you need to look away. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to the elders of the Three Fires Confederacy, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people that are with us today. Now, I'm a specialist in osseous material culture, as Brian just mentioned, and as I like to point out whenever we have a lot of lithics people in the room, osseous technologies are equally important to building our understanding of human cognitive and behavioural evolution. And they've been particularly central in recent years in our investigations of Neanderthal cognitive capabilities and their comparison to semi-contemporaneous Homo sapiens around the globe. They've also been particularly useful for tracking social information at different scales in the European Upper Paleolithic, and particularly the Magdalenian, which I'm sure many of us will be quite familiar with. So today I'm going to touch on 3 of my favourite research topics and would like to share with you some lessons I've learned from Indigenous Australia and some insights that have been gifted to me by the traditional owners with which I work. Okay. So just as a little reminder, as we heard yesterday from Helen's talk, Sahul, or Greater Australia and New Guinea with Tasmania, has a Homo sapiens only archaeological record of 65,000 plus years. It's a long record across multiple and changing environments. And here I'm showing the location of Griffith and Arche in Brisbane, Australia, with some of our most important staff members, as you can see here in one of our buildings. And for the parents of small children, it is also important to know that Griffith is the home of Bluey. And if you're watching Bluey, you'll see small references to Arche's current archaeological research in the background, as well as some of our more famous duck cake desserts. So Australia is home to some 250 plus countries, or what are called nations, here in the United States. And it has oral history stretching back at least 37,000 years. So this is very much a storied landscape, and that 37,000 year date comes from this paper down here in 2020, which was able to put an argon date on the story, Gunchumara story of the twin eruptions of Butch-Bim and Tower Hill volcanoes. So oral histories can be very old and are demonstratively old in Sahul. Australia is also very famous for our fauna, very unique, very colourful, and this fauna was turned into a huge range of material culture. Everything that was, sorry, going the wrong way. that could be used to make items of tools and ornamentation was used. But for my study, I focused on those that were either osseous or keratin-based, as marine shell had received quite a bit of attention in the past. And while lithics have a lot of attention from scholars in Australia, the bone material culture, the claw, has been largely ignored. So for the past 4 years, I've been trying to gather together everything we know from the archaeological, ethnographic record and oral histories about items made from bone, tooth, claw, stingray barb, beaks, turtle shell, echidna quill, and cassowary casque. And here you can see some of those items. So I was looking to try and document and describe these different material culture items across the country, and looking for identifying stylistic attributes which may allow the reconnection of stolen materials to communities. So why I was doing this is that first, previous archaeological research has demonstrated at least 46,000 year history of bone material culture in Australia, but it has been previously ignored. And the tools and ornaments continue to be made into the present, but some information has been lost owing to the impact of European invasion and things like the stolen generation. So in this map, you can see a distribution of the material culture currently curated in Australian museums that I was able to gather together. And while there is a good distribution across the continent, there are regions that are particularly favoured and items of material culture that are particularly favoured, owing to what we call the coffee cup perimeter, or, a certain way away from coffee from major cities, male-dominated collectors and ethnographers and archaeologists being particularly interested in fishing spears or other spears, and then, of course, differential preservation. So much of the Australian continent has a very hostile preservation environment for organic materials. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of examples today. The first is bone awls. So you can see here some images of bone awls from across Australia. This is a universal tool utilised in a range of everyday tasks. They are generally made on macropod, fibula, or emu cassowary, or other large animal long bones, usually the leg bones. And they can be hafted with resin, so spinifex resin, beeswax, and sometimes they have a string overlay like you can see in the photograph here. These are used for piercing skins, like making possum skin cloaks, weaving baskets, shellfish collection and processing, used as eating utensils. They are often multi-purpose, but not always. And in some countries, they cross into ornamentation, or people will use them as a nose bone as well. Now, the problem with these things is that they're very common, but they also have exactly the same morphology as a weapon used to murder individuals. And while murder is quite rare in Aboriginal Australia, you need to have done something very serious to deserve such a punishment. This is the type of weapon that was used to get through the ribcage. And they also have exactly the same morphology as death pointers, which I'm about to show on the next slide. So here you can see two photographs of death pointers on the second, on the left-hand side of the slide. And if you have a bone unipoint in your collection here at UMMAA, it is probably a death pointer. These are what got around a lot for not accidental reasons. So these are also made on macrobod, emu, and cassowary long bones, but we also see human long bones being used quite a lot. And they typically feature a very high polish. They're very acute. At their distal extremity, they can have incised decorations, often in the desert region, but not always. They will also have the resin at their proximal end and often have human hair string attached. They can also have eagle down and talons attached as well to make them extra powerful. Now, these tools are not used in a physical manner, like the murder weapons I just mentioned. They are a sorcery weapon, which is used by, in some countries, only medicine men are allowed to use them. In other countries, any individual can use them. And they use them in ceremony of bone pointing or pointing the bone. And once you've had the bone pointed at you, you very quickly become sick and die. And these are considered extremely dangerous even today. And when I've asked permission to view these, elders have been very concerned about me seeing these items and given very strict instructions on how to deal with them and who to call if something should go wrong. On the other side, we've got a cassowary bone dagger, and I've got that there just to show you that they also embody information about the animals from which they come. So the cassowary bone is good for making sharp points, but the cassowary is extremely dangerous. So there's no doubt that part of the animal's ferociousness, and you can see one recently trying to chase down some rangers up in North Queensland, is part of the reason of why this material culture was chosen. Now, with this overlap between death pointers and everyday, very mundane tools creates a problem for Australian museum curators, especially Indigenous curators. They don't want to accidentally see death pointers. This is not culturally safe. So I've been trying to work out how we can separate them if that's at all possible. But there is a lot of problems in that this very dangerous weapon has pretty much everything an everyday awl could have. So there's not any one thing that we can say, well, if it has human hair string, it is a death pointer, because some mundane awls also have human hair string. And furthermore, the most stylistic component of these halves, where we have the woven material over the top, is often removed and recycled once that awl is finished. So something that archaeologists would find very useful is removed when that item is getting recycled or destroyed. Okay, now I'm going to move on to ornamentation, and here I've got a number of images of men and women from across the continent. Perhaps most interesting today is this portrait of Wiraddi, who's the husband of Truganini, which is a very famous Tasmanian woman. And you can see him covered here in red ochre, which was the Tasmanian tradition time of colonial invasion. I'm going to focus on forehead ornaments. You can see them in photographs here. They're generally a women's ornament, though you've got two examples of men wearing them here. And they are a large pendant made from resin into which macropod incisors are inserted, though they can also be seen examples with echidna quills, crocodile teeth, and other components put into them. They're again very common form of ornamentation, but particularly in the north and centre of the continent, and they've been widely collected and shown in photographs. However, what we can't really see in these photographs, and if you look at these examples, I mean, these are quite clear photographs at the time. They look quite bland on the resin component, but when you see them in museums, you discover that they're often painted, they're engraved or have mouldings put into them, and they're much more complex than we are led to believe from the photographs or descriptions that we have in text. So this is something I'd like to look into next. So from the current information, trying to look at if particular countries or language groups are using particular styles, there does seem to be some separation in who's making what, which as archaeologists, we always like something that we can track back to place. However, this becomes a bit murky when we look into the ethnographic descriptions, where we find that reciprocity with ornamentations is very important in Indigenous Australia. And here I've got two examples, the first being about the Bangarang, where Curry observed that individuals neither kissing, shaking hands, nor any other salutation was made of the kind was used amongst the tribe. They frequently, men of different tribes made exchanges of arms or articles of dress in tokens of goodwill, and women in like manner exchanged ornaments. And then Leichhardt, European explorer, similarly noted that when he met with peoples on his travels, that they would give him ornaments on which they were currently wearing on their person, and he would give an exchange of often axe heads and other materials that they are carrying with them. So this kind of opportunistic reciprocity, where they're not really planning to trade these items, but when they come across individuals in their travels, it's like a show of friendship and goodwill, means that these ornaments made in one country can travel many different countries without ever having been designed to do so. Here you can see a famous photograph of Southeast Australian man with two young companions wearing nose bones, but there's also another one here in his armband. Okay, so that brings us to alternate ways of doing. So I mentioned the resin halves, and here you can see examples of different technologies. This is an engraving tool, stone tool, and then this is a war shark tooth knife, which I was talking about with some of the students the other day. So the Spinifex resin grass is used to create comfortable handholds and to connect different components together, and it is fully recyclable. So when you produce it, it's very moldable. It's like blue tack, smells really good. You can mold it into whatever shape, and as it cools down, it hardens. But then as soon as you heat it up again, it becomes flexible again, and you can peel it off and reuse it. And this is the same with ornamentation. It is extremely rare to perforate a tooth or any item that for ornamentation on the Australian continent. This is not an approach that is used. I only know of 3 archaeological examples of perforations. They've found alternate ways to connect parts together, and you can see here a beautiful macropog tooth necklace worn by a chiefess of the Morport tribe down in Victoria. And you can see how they use little strips of kangaroo leather where it's encased the root of the tooth, and then sinew or other twine is used to keep them together. So no perforations needed. And again, example of a head ornament, a very similar approach. And then the Aranda eagle claw headpiece here or necklace. This is a young woman dressed up for a celebration. And you can see her wearing the eagle talons here with a bandicoot tail at the other end. And interestingly, when you move these, they make a very pleasant tinkling sound. They're quite pretty. They're like little bells. Now, this is particularly interesting with the recent work that's come out of Italy and Western Europe in regards of Neanderthal use of eagles and other birds of prey. And there's been a lot of discussion about trying to identify Neanderthal symbolic behavior and ornaments, and are they even capable of making ornaments? They don't have perforations, when there is obviously ways that are able to connect things together without perforations. So looking at Neanderthal ways of doing, we commonly thought that they had effectively closed social networks. They had much smaller populations that were much more dispersed over Western Europe and into Eurasia. And that when you look at their raw materials and how far away they're coming to collect things, there's this real rarity of exotics, both in stone and other items, particularly marine shell. So we talk about them having a smaller landscape of habit and a lack of regular trade relationships, which we're very much interested in as modern humans. So overall, this has built this picture of a less complex stylistic behavior. They're less complex symboling behavior. They're less complex people. But you have to wonder, is the lack of exotics really owing to just opportunistic reciprocity? Is some of this exotic stuff coming in when they have just accidentally met another group on the landscape and made these overtures of goodwill and friendship rather than a trade for trade's sake? The later Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens seem very interested in trading for things very far away, but perhaps Neanderthals just weren't interested in things like that we are. Which brings me to, does the Neanderthal record reflect behavior of individuals, as in those cases, more than the behavior of groups that are really actively asserting their group identities and politics? Or is the material culture used in signalling simply not visible archaeologically, like it is often in Australia? Which brings me to my next love, the Magdalenian, where we have a lot of osseous material culture. Happily for archaeologists, the Magdalenians were ultra stylistic. Everything in osseous materials, which is usually reindeer, antler, but can also be mammoth ivory or bone, is decorated either through their morphology, it's engraved, it's painted, and they like things to be a very certain way. There is a very highly standardized way to make their various tools and ornaments. When you find something in a site, you know exactly who's made it and what period, early, middle, or late Magdalenian, to which it belongs. So they appear very prolific in their artistic creations, but also we need to keep in mind the great preservation conditions of Western European caves and the long archaeological history in that region as well. So recent studies have continued this long history of using such items and tracking social information. And they are used to identify connections between the super sites or aggregation sites, the territories, and perhaps even identifying individual craftspeople in the case of those spiral decorated rods. Now, I myself has looked into this in their projectile weaponry, and if we looked at the unbarbed points, if you're looking at the very proximal edge of these bevels, you can see that there are different shapes, which is interesting because once these things are hafted, you don't see them. They're not visible on the landscape. It's only something that's visible when they're made and then later discarded. So this is something perhaps of a community of practice on how these projectile points should look, as opposed to their barbed technology where we have a widespread pattern of very highly standardized barbs and the decorations on the barbs, particularly in the bilaterally barbed ones. And in the literature, they're often thought about to be transmitting a cohesive Magdalenian identity, but it could equally display an intention for conflict. So in Australia, there are stories that the barbed spears only comes out when there are hostile relations being signaled on the landscape. So this is kind of straying into this whole noble savage notion of everything's about togetherness and cohesiveness and social glues, when really it could be something quite different. So the abundance of style in the Magdalenian record is often used as a proxy for increasing information flow during the Upper Paleolithic. However, when we head back to Australia, things get a bit more complicated. So here I am showing an example of a very small bone point. This is a 1 millimeter scale bar, and it's made on bone, shearwater bird bone, and then a beautiful plant called the Gymea lily. And these have a very intricate relationship, which only becomes evident when you're talking to traditional owners. So even when you understand where these bone points come from, and that's something we've only really demonstrated recently, that they are tipping multi-pronged fishing spears commonly seen on the New South Wales coast at European contact, the connection to the Gymea lily is still not evident to archaeologists. It's only once we talk to the traditional owners that the story becomes available and we can see these connections. So this is a story as told by master storyteller and UN elder Julie Freeman, and you can see the full story as available in this paper we published in Cambridge Archaeological Journal recently. But in short, this is a Dharawa love story about Krobi, otherwise known as Gymea, and her husband Bunda. So Bunda had left for battle with the other men of her people because the Wiradjuri, next nation over, had come to still see women who were very good at diving and collecting shellfish and fishing. So the men had gone to retrieve their women. And whenever he would return from battle, the women would be waiting up on the escarpment in their possum skin cloaks, but he could never tell which was his beautiful Krobi. So he made her a beautiful red feather collar, so that when she was sitting up on the escarpment, he would be able to tell which of the women was his beautiful wife. Now, one day the men went for battle to retrieve the women from the Wiradjuri, and when returning, the other men had to tell Krobi that Bunda had lost his life in battle and he would not be coming back. However, she refused to move because she had made a promise to him that she would wait there on the escarpment for him. And despite the other women and the men trying to encourage her to move over back to the coast with them, she would stay there, and eventually she died from starvation. So as her body fell into the cracks of the escarpment, it turned into the Gymea lily. The women come back the next year and discovered this plant that they had never seen before, with this beautiful red feathers like flower, which you can see here, and the black cockatoo from which these red feathers originally came from no longer has their red feathers in respect for Krobi, Bunda, and their great love. So there's a lot of things in here that this plant is important for fishing because the stalks are now used as part of the foreshafts of the spear. And the leaves of this plant are used for making the fishing scoops and baskets. And the people use this plant and have stories and songs about this story in respect of Croby and the gift that she has given her people. And this is just the story that's available to non-Yuin people. So I'm sure there are many levels that we are not being told. But I think it's a good example of how complex some of these things are. And this is where I kind of feel like I should have been in an earlier session where we were talking about loops and circles. Archaeologically, we'll find examples of bone points, we'll find the economic marine fauna, and we'll see people fishing with the technology. So we see these straight lines. We're always looking for these straight connections when really human storytelling, particularly through things, is branching and recursive, as we see with the story of Gaimia. So if archaeology is unable to really build narratives which reflect this natural human storytelling form, are we even able to identify the presence of messaging and the volume of messaging at all? Okay, so just to summarise, I think from Indigenous Australia over the last 4 years, I've learned that the complexity of messaging through material culture is very difficult to identify. The invisibility in archaeological contexts is very apparent once community members are involved, and the impact of reciprocity and recycling on the availability of stylistic or messaging data that we're most interested in really comes to the fore. And we need to remember that, when we're talking about people from a deep type record, even other human species, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and reciprocity may be operating in Neanderthal communities. And I know we all tell each other that we understand and we make allowances for absence of evidence and all of these different things we see ethnographically, but I often feel like we really don't. We really need to be like, are we really taking into account these things we see in modern day peoples when we're trying to assess cognitive or behavioral patterns for people in deep time? And particularly when we look at the Magdalenian stone records, very much appear amplified, but do they really mean more messaging activity is happening, or is it just that we can't see it? And furthermore, shared style over space doesn't always point to social cohesive glues. It could just be making sure that the message is understood from far. So just I'd like to acknowledge Brian for the invitation, and also the elders, communities and individuals who have shared their knowledge and culture about their countries and material culture have made this work possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Provocative and super, thought-provoking. Okay, I'm going to put this up before I launch into my next explanation. Is this one of these four? Is the title side one of the forehead? Is this one of the forehead ornaments? Is that one of them? So cool. Okay, thanks again. Our next speaker is Ben Fitzhugh, professor of anthropology at the University of Washington and an UMMA alum who received both his PhD and master's from the University of Michigan, having come to Ann Arbor from Chapel Hill, am I correct? Yes, where he took his BA at UNC. Ben's research focuses on human environmental dynamics and archaeological histories of coastal hunter-gatherers, especially in the North Pacific. This research addresses questions of human vulnerability and resilience in remote subarctic environments. He collaborates widely with scholars across a range of disciplines in atmospheric, earth and biological sciences, and takes a historical ecological perspective on human adjustments to environments in which they live. Recent efforts include the development of international collaborations to explore human-environment coevolution in the North Pacific Rim, and most recently in the North Atlantic since the last glacial maximum. His talk is entitled Between Rocks and Hard Places, an Evolutionary Perspective on Why Social Networks Are Not a Panacea in Human Evolution. And as far as I understand, it's been a while since he's been here. Sorry for the pun so early in the morning. Take it away.
Too much technology. Okay. Let's see if that works. Thank you very much, Brian. It is wonderful to be back here. I'm going to do a slightly complicated thing and probably read a bit of my talk just so that I don't run incredibly over. Okay, you'll notice a slight change in the title of my talk as I thought more about what I was actually going to try to do here. So I want to first thank the organizers for a really fantastic several days of meetings, the opportunity to come back here after about 27 years and dive back into deep intellectual conversations with the newest crop of students has been really remarkable. Those of us who teach in programs with fewer graduate students, who are unable to support quite as many graduate students, will recognize that it's a really remarkable and almost unique opportunity to have such a group of people together sharing intellectually. I understand the coffee range has been a bit moribund since COVID, but certainly I benefited tremendously from just sort of the daily interaction with my fellows and those curators who came to lunch on a regular basis in the coffee range. Those of you who don't know, that's basically was just the North American lab that had a giant table and a refrigerator, and we would show up every day and have lunch. We don't have that kind of space at the University of Washington, so our students unfortunately have to find other places to congregate. All right, so as Brian noted in the session's introduction, there's a long history of anthropological and archaeological research and theorizing around social networks and risk here at the University of Michigan, sorry. A hugely influential figure in this area is Polly Wiesner, who since the 1970s has conducted research with the Juntuasi people of the Kalahari. Her study of Sharo interaction networks and her argument that an important reason for their social networking was to mitigate ecological risks was exciting at the time, both because of its conceptual elegance and its articulation with the material record. If social networks were materialized in gift exchanges, then archaeologists could also use artifacts and other material traces to make inferences about social interactions in the deep past, as we saw from the last talk. As a graduate student at the University of Michigan in 1990, I learned of Polly's insights during my first year in the program in Bob Whalen's famous, or depending on your perspective, infamous Arc 1 class, and about Bob's application of the concept to questions about the evolution of behavioral modernity in the Paleolithic. I went on to do regional settlement analysis and community-based research on and for the Sugpiaq Nunavut people in Old Harbor, Alaska, and I defended my PhD thesis in 1996. I did not return explicitly to questions about social networks until much later. In 2006, after 10 field seasons on Kodiak, I had the opportunity to initiate a large regional project in the Kuril Islands in the Northwest Pacific. There, I spearheaded an interdisciplinary survey project of the Kuril Islands that resulted in a comprehensive settlement history of the islands, bookended at the ends by Hokkaido and Kamchatka. In 2008, Bob asked me to participate in an SAA panel that led to the publication Information and its role in hunter-gatherer bands, as you can see here. It was a serendipitous invitation because it enabled us to conceptualize a model of social networks in the Kurils that helped my students, Colby Phillips and Eric Yesfeld, orient their studies on lithic and pottery movements through the Kurils. The paper was, for me, a return to the intellectual roots nurtured in Bob's Arc 1 class, and, if I'm being honest, a partial concession to my decade-long intellectual rebellion as an SGS, skeptical graduate student, for those of you not immersed in the Michigan canon, in which I had embraced the unspeakably evil reductionism of human behavioral ecology, albeit only heuristically. For this talk, I try to build on the 2011 paper, bringing in some of the newer evidence we have generated since to aid as thought props as I explore the possibility that social networks are not always good, in the double sense of not desirable in some cases, and also, perhaps more often, as simply broken. I hope that what follows provides an acceptable example of how archaeological research can borrow from and contribute to generalizable insights, while also producing place-based stories that acknowledge historical contingencies. Given the time limits, I'm sure I will leave something on the table, but I hope the talk stimulates good thinking. After all, that's what theory is about. And I would, sort of hearkening back to Jerry's final comments on Thursday evening, I would say that theory isn't actually about accumulating something as it is about stimulating our interpretations of the world. So I see theory as process, not product. And with gratitude to Bob, thank you, Bob, for his inspiration, encouragement, and indeed friendship over the years, I will start off my exploration of past social networks in the Kuriles. I hope to end with some reflections about isolation, marginalization, in quotes, and resilience in the frame of social networks. Sorry, there's my outline. Okay, so very quickly, the Kuriles Islands are a 1,000-kilometer long linear volcanic archipelago running from Hokkaido to Kamchatka. They are geologically active. There are something like 42 volcanic eruptions in historic record, multiple eruptions of the same volcano. So you can't go anywhere in the Kuriles that doesn't have some semi-active volcano. They're ecologically vulnerable as well. There's limited terrestrial biology, limited terrestrial animals and plant diversity, and productive but shallow, that is to say not very rich, not very many species, marine systems. A key insight in Polly Wiesner's ethnography and Bob's model was that people living in low-density populations, presumably because of low resource productivity and unpredictability, are nevertheless, indeed necessarily, connected to other people living at a distance. Another Michigan alum, Martin Bopes, you notice we're citing all the same people today, deserves mention here for his influential 1974 paper, Simulating Minimal Human Reproductive Population Networks. If one accepts the assumption of the model, Bopes found that reproductive populations needed to be at least 100 to 300 individuals to have a reasonable chance at avoiding stochastic extinction in about a 200-year sort of modeling interval. We can take this range as the ballpark, a minimal social network scale. There could be reasons to have much more maximal social scales, but if you get smaller than that, more isolated than that, you may not be able to persist for very long. And of course, modelers like Marcos and others have sort of modified and refined these estimates in all kinds of sophisticated ways. We can take this, let's see, of course, social networks do many more things for people than help them find marriage partners. They allow for the exchange of useful products, raw materials, useful products and raw materials. They facilitate the development and practice of important cultural rituals and the maintenance of proper relations with the world according to cultural protocols. And as made explicit in the title of the Information Networks volume, social networks facilitate the sharing of information. And information itself plays a critical role in reducing uncertainties about the state of the world beyond the range of regular experience. Since these early efforts, social network thinking has moved into a wide range of social science disciplines, inspiring an explosion of methodological, theoretical, and ontological changes and challenges to how networks are studied and conceptualized. Indeed, how we think about human social organizations and change. As Marcus's paper earlier gives an example of this expanding field. A recent study also cited by Marcus, which is featured here, this image, comes from Doug Bird and colleagues in 2019, which documents the complex and extensive social networking relationships among the Martu of Australia. They argue that hunter-gatherers do not live in small and hierarchically nested social groups that earlier anthropologists have often assumed following the landmark study of Birdsell in 1958, but are much more cosmopolitan, that's my term, in their interaction and integration with others. They write, foraging group composition is dominated by networks of interaction between individuals with distant, spatially and genetically, or genetic ties, and group size is not directly determined by environmental conditions. Group size and composition emerge from histories of investments to supply resources that support expansive social relations. This should not surprise us. What archaeologists have not always acknowledged, however, is the implications indigenous communities around the world have long engaged in extensive interaction networks. The discovery of Oregon obsidian on the Amberley Ridge, reported to us yesterday by Ashley Lemke, is a case in point. Copper, shell, turquoise, and other valued goods traded throughout pre-colonial North America is a more recent example. Or in this case, a map of materials traded across Alaska and Siberia based on ethnohistoric sources provides a third. It would not be hard for me to believe that Native Americans living in the late Holocene had access to sufficient information through these trade routes and information networks that passed between them, that they had a reasonable sense of the social geography of the entire continent and beyond. The same was probably true in most of the world, wherever such information was not rigorously controlled or people had the autonomy to pursue it. That hints at the fact that there may be circumstances in which information networks are constrained by social and political geographies. So an implication of Wiesner's model of social networks, or at least how it has been used by archaeologists, tends to focus on the adaptive benefits of social networking because it provides information that reduces uncertainty in times of need. In many or most cases, we might be justified in having access to more information and social connections. We might be justified that having access to more information and social networks is a good thing. In fact, I think almost most of the time it is, if we can sustain the effort and expense of keeping them active. The goal of this talk is to explore the reasons people might choose to separate themselves from a social network, or how they could otherwise become isolated from social contacts and made more vulnerable as a result. I will approach the situation with reference to the potential positive and negative consequences of ecological, demographic, social, and epidemiological predictability. So, things aren't always equal. There are four variables for considering. If we start with a paper that we published in 2011, we proposed a model showing that people should be willing to pay higher networking costs if they have chosen or been compelled to live in ecologically marginal, geologically hazardous, and relatively isolated places. That is, places where people face hurdles, maintaining the kinds of open social networks represented in the Martu case and similar continental scale networks. A second and broader theme of my talk today is an effort to integrate a socio-ecological model designed to be general and cross-cultural with what, for lack of a better term, archaeologists have been calling history or historical contingency. The two goals of comparative generalization and accounting for real histories of people embedded in particular places and times are often posed as antagonistic. And here I hearken back to the theme threading through the plenary panel discussion on Thursday evening. Is it still appropriate to pursue generalizable knowledge? Everyone on the panel who addressed the question seems to agree that the answer is a qualified yes. I'm tempted to jump down a deep epistemic rabbit hole about how everything we call knowledge is necessarily comparative, or with a nod to Alison Wiley, analogical, in some sense. But for the sake of time and to remain focused on my task, I will not. But I do take it to heart that implicit in the theme is a question coming from the all too necessary post-colonial and decolonizing space that draws attention to the genealogy's implicit goals methods and potential uses of comparative research we might choose to pursue. So this is the model that we put together, and we were looking, and we basically suggested that when you live in a very remote place, you have to pay exceedingly high costs to maintain those social networks over distance and difficult crossings like water crossings. And that might require subsidizing or specializing in those people who maintain those connections. This is the Kuril Islands. Between 2000 and 2016, I directed and participated in 5 seasons of fieldwork in the Kurils. We documented approximately 80 sites from one end of the archipelago to the other. We rented 80-meter-long Russian ships and surveyed the entire chain with an interdisciplinary team. The archaeologists digging test pits at most sites, we located and conducted larger excavations at 7 of them. And that's the basis for the data that I'm using today. To give you a necessary temporal framing, with apologies, I give you a historical framework here that's been used by developed by Japanese and Russian archaeologists. And the reason that it's important to know something about the culture history of the Kurils isn't just to help us break up time in various ways, but it's because, in fact, the late Jomon and Epi-Jomon coming out of Japan and Hokkaido are then replaced by another group of people, the Okhotsk, who come out of Sakhalin and through Kurils. These are biologically distinct and culturally distinct populations. So it's a kind of a population replacement in the Kurils. And then the Ainu, who are actually a synthesis of these two populations, come back into the Kurils a third time for very different reasons. All right, so I just showed that so that I can use those words as we talk about what's happened at different times in the Kurils. In addition to a lot of site maps and moderate amounts of artifacts and fauna that one can get from a survey project, the most integrative result of our research, by design, was a radiocarbon population model. For the moment, assume that this more or less accurately characterizes trends in population growth and decline. We're particularly interested in the deviations from the dashed line. This is not a taphonomically corrected curve. I will use one later, but this is an older slide that was clean and I liked it, so I use that for clarity. So we're particularly interested in the deviations from that sort of taphonomic correction, if you will, the dramatic increases and decreases at scales of hundreds to 1,000 years. All right, so we can assume that general slope may just be loss of evidence as you move back through time. But the deviations, the residuals, are the really important pieces. Okay, to put this curve in perspective, using dated house pits with a liberal use of min-max assumptions, I estimated last night the maximum population of the Okhotsk period, the peak there, at somewhere under 3,000 people, but probably considerably less. I'll spare you the calculations. I even went down and figured out, at least estimated, not that I would believe it, that in fact some of the biggest villages probably only had 5 or 6 houses, maybe a little bit more than that, even though we have as many as 100 house pits. We did radiocarbon dates of individual houses through probes, and then we dug test pits, and we could say, well, okay, if we make some assumptions, how many components might each house have? And then you go back and look at that. So in fact, interestingly enough, if you back calculate that, it comes out to a residential population in some of these larger populations somewhere in the order of 18 to 36 people. And this is a very different situation than the kinds that Marcus was modeling. So I don't know whether we want to put much faith in that, but it's something. All right, but it also means that when we go down into these troughs, we're running into situations where it might be hard to maintain populations in subregions of the archipelago over long periods of time. Assuming that the source signatures of artifacts can reveal their movements across the land and seascape, we have tried to map changing social networks with obsidian and pottery. The work that Colby and Eric conducted showed 2 scales of social networks in the Epi-Jomon and Okhotsk intervals. While all indications are that these groups migrated into the Kurils from Hokkaido, obsidian sources show a nearest source model during the epigemone and during the epigemone period, in which you get obsidian. So there's no obsidian in the archipelago itself. All of the obsidian comes from, I shouldn't do that for people who may be online. Let me see if I can do this way. So all of this obsidian is coming from Kamchatka, even though that's not where these people originated. All of this obsidian in the south is coming from Hokkaido, and they overlap in the middle, which indicates that people were interacting off the archipelago and into the middle archipelago, maintaining an open social network, but that they were not doing it so frequently that they would be carrying obsidian from one end of the archipelago to the other. In fact, the size reduction of obsidian in the islands gets smaller as you move to the middle. They're conserving obsidian in this time. The pottery analysis, which is based on the assumption that your center of gravity of the source, we don't know where the clay came from, but the clay sources must have been in these clusters. And it looks like people were interacting, using pottery, making pottery, and sharing pottery only within these sub-island, sub-archipelago clusters, which tells us that they probably were not moving throughout the archipelago every year. They had regional, they were constricted in their sort of regular interaction social network with a subset of the islands. That is true for both the epigemone and the Okhotsk. The Okhotsk obsidian pattern, however, shows things, throws things into a twist. While they also came from the south, as far as we can tell, as part of the expansion of Okhotsk people from northern Hokkaido down into eastern Hokkaido and then up into the Kuriles. They don't ever use, well, we didn't find any Hokkaido obsidian. All of their obsidian was coming from Kamchatka. We also didn't find Okhotsk sites in the southern islands. And I'll try to explain that in a few minutes. So while they should have, let's see, their entire off-archipelago obsidian access then seems to be based on networks established by new friends in Kamchatka. What could that be? What could have caused that? To explore possible answers, I turn to the 4 risks I mentioned earlier in the talk. I'm not going to go through every word on this slide. This is really just an effort to show you that there is ecological structure in the Kuriles. The southern islands are most closely associated with Hokkaido. They were actually attached to Hokkaido during the last glacial maximum. They have the most diverse terrestrial and marine resources, the largest islands, the greater opportunity for living close beside your neighbors. And so they have high diversity, high productivity, and so on. The northern islands have connections with Kamchatka. They were also connected. They also get occasional terrestrial mammals like bears swimming across to the islands. And they also have somewhat more robust, there's more shellfish and other kinds of resources there. The central islands are really the challenge. These are little, tiny, small volcanic islands with great distances between them that have only marine resources available. And those resources are not highly, with the exception of sea mammals, those resources are not highly productive. So the point here, of course, is that if you have periodic failure, ecological failure of any of your taxa, you don't have a lot of depth to shift, to prey switch, or do other things. You are going to need social networks occasionally to make it through those more difficult times. Oh my God, I forgot to start my clock. Okay, thank you. All right, well, I'm not that far away. So if we look from ecological to demographic variability, and we look at this, we might say, if we're just talking about sort of minimum networks for marriage, that we would expect when populations get denser in the Kuriles, you don't need to have extensive social networks. But when they are low, you really need those extensive social networks. So we might expect then that residential mobility was, that we would see increased residential mobility, increased networking in these low periods. This is the North scenario where you could end up being stranded and go extinct, in the Greenland North scenario. And year-round residence and less social networking during these peak time periods. All right. Now I want to shift and talk quickly about asymmetric network dynamics. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but if we assume that there is a difference in if we assume that networking has cost and that the values of networks can be understood in some sense in an economic way, we can use marginal utility models to sort of think about when you would pay more and invest more in networking and when you would not. And so what we're basically looking at are sort of effort versus benefit models. Effort is the X, Y is value. That in new occupation of the islands or low densities, there's high value in networking, and where you have high ecological vulnerability. You'll expect to see that. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have high population densities, if you have high resource diversity and low ecological risk, you shouldn't be willing to pay a whole lot for that. That has implications then for dyadic relationships with people in different parts of the archipelago or off the archipelago, and whether they're willing to pay costs in these situations. So basically, if you're living in a robust area, you don't have a lot of need for social networks, and you were partnering with somebody in an area that has high need for social networks, there's asymmetry and imbalance. Let's just think about it this way, that the central and northern islands, you might expect more of a balanced reciprocity between the center and the margin, the central and the northern islands. But if you look at the southern islands, just from an ecological perspective, you might expect to see that folks in the south would see less value in paying a high cost to maintain those networks, whereas people in the north or in the center might really need those networks. That creates an imbalance. All right. Let's just throw in here very quickly that you can also have disease, since COVID brought all of this home, and you could be highly vulnerable to diseases. Smallpox arrived in Japan in the 700 AD, right about the time that Hokkaido was starting to get connected to mainland Japan. And that is also the same time that the Ohuts started moving out into the Kuril Islands. It's an indirect relationship, but it's possible that what they were doing was trying to escape disease episodes and in the process cut themselves off from the south. All right. In conclusion, while I can't yet test these propositions against the Kuril evidence for a variety of reasons, the works we have done in the Kurils in conjunction with what is shown about the region's biogeography and culture history, and the theoretical insights on social networking inspired by Junhua Si and the work of Polly Wiesner, Bob Whalen, and others, allows us to explore the ways that communities can become vulnerable, both by the loss of their networks, but also by their existence. Inevitably, social networking involves trade-offs between the potential benefits, known costs, and risks and uncertainties involved. Why does this matter? Social networks are fundamental to social and cultural life. We would not be who we are or what we are without them. But people can be marginalized in social networks in ways intentionally or unintentionally. Networks like those maintained by the Martu and their neighbors create resilience and mutual support by giving everyone access to large numbers of equally interdependent or autonomous partners. In the Kurils, probably multiple times over the past 2 millennia, people probably became vulnerable both to overexposure to unequal political, economic, or disease-bearing relationships with their southern neighbors, and or they were cut off from needed support because of market activities beyond their access, beyond their direct knowledge, changes in the price of goods or the trade markets that happened. In fact, that group, the amalgamation of Okhotsk and the Satsumon group that became what is known as Tobi Nitai in eastern Hokkaido, they turned inward, they went up the rivers, they stopped being marine-oriented, and that effectively created a gap that prevented people in the central and northern islands from networking, maintaining those relationships. It forced them to turn north, which is probably why their obsidian is dominated by northern obsidian. So, are social networks a panacea for risk and uncertainty? In the examples given, social networks can be seen to be important over long intervals. At the same time, there can be reason why people could find it important to cut their ties. This could happen, well, I've talked about why this could happen. The global and national, social, economic, and political networks of today also carry risks, especially for communities marginalized by their entrained dependence on support from those networks, creating vulnerabilities of being cut off from access to information and the support services that would ensure mutual security and well-being. I'm going to give you just one out of 3 examples to understand this. In the late 17th century, after Russian explorers and tax collectors started demanding tribute from the Ainu in the northern end of the Kuril Islands, a group of Ainu moved to the central Kuril Islands, where they could escape the imposition of taxation by a colonialist power. They didn't go all the way down to Hokkaido because the Japanese were coming from the other direction, competing for control of the Kurils. We actually found the archaeological record of this population. You can see an Ainu house pit there on the left and a trade bead here on the right that represents this group of people who, at least over the short term, tried to escape the imposition of colonial power by getting into these islands. At the same time, when we're connected to these kinds of social networks, it is those people who have been marginalized by the social asymmetries and political economies of much more networked, more hierarchical groups that are most vulnerable to changes in the global network. Think about the economic crash of 2008 or the COVID pandemic today. So I think I'll leave it there and hope that gave you some food for thought at least. Thank you.
We're going to move away from hunter-gatherers for a moment and go into the realm of pastoralists, accumulators. With our with our 4th speaker, I believe, I can't count, too hungover. I'm just kidding. Brian Miller, our very own new curator of Chinese archaeology here at UMMA, very proud of that, and an assistant professor in Central Asian art and archaeology in the Department of the History of Art here at University of Michigan. His research incorporates textual analyses and material culture studies to investigate the dynamics of empires, mostly in East Asia, although that's not exactly what he's going to be talking about today. And in particular, his work on pastoral nomadic regimes challenges normative constructs of cultural politics, economic systems, and socio-political institutions. He's conducted examinations of Chinese documents, as well as led archaeological survey and excavation projects in various regions of Mongolia, and just returned from there with Alicia Ventresca-Miller. And most recently, he performed microscopic studies and protein analyses of garment remains recovered from those excavations. His interdisciplinary approach lies at the core of his current book, which I wanted to plug shamelessly on his behalf, called Shongu, the World's First Nomadic Empire, which is coming out in, this should be coming out this spring with Oxford University Press. And his talk today is called Centering the Social, or How to Build a Large-Scale Polity with Small-Scale Societies. Thanks, Brian.
Right. Okay. Now, is it picking up now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So thank you for welcoming the random empire person to a discussion of small-scale societies. Although I've been actually really happy to see how many people are challenging this notion of small-scale societies, and I think that's really a lot of what I want to talk about today. So most of it is just sort of like a food for thought, kind of things like networks thinking. I don't have like a nice, beautiful networks graph yet, although Stephanie Crabtree has told me we have to do it. But what I want to talk about is rethinking our standpoints, rethinking the assumptions that we have. A lot of these bodies of theory, and here I will shamelessly plug, the traditions of things that have come out of the University of Michigan, because this is what it's all about, but also talk about the ways that we can try and move forward, the ways that certain case studies, be they so-called small-scale societies of hunter-gatherers or anything like pastoral groups that are creating these large empires. And when we look at most of the sort of models that we have for understanding these things, they just don't fit. Not the case study that my colleagues and I work with in Mongolia and Inner Asia. And too often, even though we can pull out notions of assemblages, interactions, social dynamics, but what's the underlying standpoint of most of the models that we actually have? They are unsettled, agricultural, societies that create large polities. And so if you have to create a large polity, you have to have this sort of like child's checklist of you must have cities, you must have surplus storage, which is a whole other thing. And so what most of us have tried to do is sort of stand back and say, well, what are the underlying assumptions and standpoints of the models we have? And so we're dipping into networks theory, all these other theories to try and figure things out. And for that, I'd say I'm very lucky to be going near the end because I've been frantically taking notes on all the presentations that have been done so far. So while myself and other people clearly stand on the shoulders of all the giants of archaic state research and other things that have been done here at University of Michigan, I'm very excited to say I'm also standing on the shoulders of just what's happened here at this event. So if I make reference to something that you did this weekend, and forgetting to plug in your name, don't worry. We can hand out bingo cards and you can put in the things like, oh, okay, Brian made reference to 5 different people who presented this weekend. I get a bingo. And I really want to thank a lot of all the things that have been said here. I think there's a lot going on about rethinking the ontologies that we don't think about that we're bringing to the table. All the push for native science, I think, is fantastic. I mean, I'm just thinking of the applications for myself for mobile pastoral societies. And as Tiffany Fryer was mentioning, this idea of transferable models, I think, is a really interesting way to look forward to not trying to make these universal things, but also thinking about how we can borrow and what we can borrow. And so what I'd like to talk about today is some of the standpoints. And I was told yesterday that I should not be embarrassed by my bizarre Shakespearean phraseology, so I'm going to leave it up there and ask, wherefore nomadology? These are famous philosophers, and we get a lot from them, but we have to understand or put out on the table the elephant in the room of what about their models? And what are they saying about mobile pastoral societies? This idea, and here I'm trying to push for, rather than just thinking in, outmoded or, not transferable notions of space and the way people use space. This idea, and this is sort of like the fetishism of the egalitarian society, the fetishism of the nomadic society. They're all egalitarian, that they're totally unstructured and that they live in this smooth, unstructured space. There's a parallel made to that nomads live in this world just like a game board of Go. And when you look at it, you think, well, that doesn't look unstructured to me. There are lines. And there are. And so this idea that they live in an open space, the idea of like holding space is not really what they do, at least not permanently. When we think about sources of social power from Michael Mann, he has this dichotomy of territorial, not territorial. And the idea implicit here is that these nomads or these mobile pastoral groups, they're not territorial, like not the way we think of. Okay, perhaps not the way we think of, but they are in a very different fashion. And we have to give them credence that they are extremely territorial, but they don't leave the same things behind. They don't use that territory or think about land and space in the same way we do. This idea that they could spring up at any moment, that they move without aim or destination, without departure or arrival. And those of us who work on mobile pastoral groups know that there's very specific circuits of movement, and you have to navigate these movements. This idea that you can vote with your feet and just move somewhere else, if you don't like it, that's impossible to do because you can't move over to this other valley because there's somebody already hurting in that valley. And if they're not there and they come back and they say that you've been there, you're in trouble. So these networks on how to use the land and how to move people around is a very complicated board. So what I'd like to do is thinking about small scale societies, or at least in order to understand how we can build up to something like on the scale of an empire, perhaps we should start at the base with individual communities. And I think just some of the presentations this morning have done a really great job of highlighting this idea of the size of that group or that individual community. If it seems small, it seems kind of thin, that really is not at all what's going on in the much larger network. And in the case of especially highly mobile pastoral groups in the steppe, even the communities themselves can be very misleading. It may seem sort of small, but what they're often doing is they're extremely fluid. So there's this word choten or chotal, all these different words that are the word for community in modern Mongolia, and have been used to sort of think about past communities. And the word chot comes from the corral. This idea that a community owns a set of animals, one herd, and they share it, and they are constantly coming back to that corral. That's what anchors them in space. And this idea that they are these different households that come back together again. So even though they might not be living together during the entire year, they see themselves as a single community, that they can sort of go apart and come back together, not just move through the landscape as this single unit, never changing. But as you move throughout the landscape during different seasons to, different pastures, you can pull and push and all these different things. So how do we approach that? How do we try and reconstruct that in the archaeological record? We can think about these so-called third places for gatherings and, thank you, ungatherings, as was mentioned earlier. This idea of like what happens when you come together and then go back apart, that you have this understanding of you are that single community unit. And so what seems to be these spatially sparse and seemingly splintered communities that are hard to pin down and aren't as efficient, I think that way of putting them together actually increases the efficiency and the resilience. So what are actually seemingly tiny communities are actually socially large communities that can build and maintain ever larger social matrices and networks. And I think it's important to sort of move it, and this is where I really enjoyed all the discussions about native science and indigenous ontologies, is I think that's where we have to start moving. We have to start thinking about the kind of economic and social institutions that were employed just to make all of this happen. So I put up here a map that's based on some data from Andrei Simukov from the early 1900s. And then sort of adapted and revised by famous Fernandez Gimenez, who's been doing a lot of work in modern Mongolia for herders. and what we see here is a whole set of social cooperations and social contracts that have to happen. You have labor pooling because of certain times of year, just like you harvest a field in agricultural models, you have to harvest that herd. Milking it, doing the shearing for wooling, all these types of things are really labor intensive. This idea that nomads don't need much labor in order to get things done is completely off the mark. We have livestock pooling as well, has been talked about, and herd sharing. The problem with herds, especially if you are in an environment not all the steppe is this way. Some places you don't even have to move because the grass is so great. But if you live in an area where the grass cannot support a massive herd, you are forced to distribute your herds. And that kind of herd sharing creates a different set of social contracts as well. Who takes the herds, how many things. This idea of storage and surplus, the fact that you can hoard the surplus, and if you want to try and understand early polities, especially empires, you go looking for the granary stores, and if you can find those, then that's evidence of, yes, they're accumulating these things. Well, there's no evidence of this kind of stuff here. That's because they're moving things around and they're thinking about storing and hoarding in a different way. And so one of the things when we go to social networks analysis, it's that social component, I think, that's actually beneficial, and it's good food for thought for instances like this. So you can have, as Rowan Flab was talking about yesterday, these sources of social power is knowledge. It's knowledge of the natural landscape and where to go and how to go, and it's knowledge of the social landscape of I can go here or I can't go there. One of the biggest things is you have all these specific circuits, and if something happens, if you have what's called a zod, like a winter disaster, just in this valley, but not in that valley, and you want to try and move out, you have to go to ask permission from a certain person in order to move outside that circuit. And the ability to do this, like otter movement, is very important for pastoralists. But who's going to manage this? Who's going to decide if you're allowed to move outside of the circuit and move into this other area where somebody's also pasturing? And how do you mediate those two families, those two communities, that they're going to come together and not fight with each other? And so what we see is the hoarding, not necessarily just of the material capital wealth, but we see this hoarding of the social capital, of the rights to be able to make these decisions and say, okay, you can go on an auto movement, you can't, I'm going to move people around. And it is perhaps like a massive Go board, but it is very structured, and you have to be very strategic on where you move those pieces and how. And so one of the things I want to think about is, rather than the traditional sort of metropole, center, core, periphery that is very spatially bounded. Actually, I'm thinking about the sort of coffee cup thing that was mentioned earlier. The political space, if we look to work by Dorian Massey and other people, that the political space is socially constructed. And so even though in archaeology what we have are these sites that are sitting there in the landscape, and I'll show some maps, I think it's good food for thought to jump back to and think about the sort of social proximity rather than least cost path analysis of like across spatial distance. What's the least cost path analysis for the social distance? Who's really, together? So we can look at these polities as social matrices and think about them outside of space as well as in the space that you see them in the landscape. But more importantly, how do local communities, when you see them on the ground and moving around, and local institutions configure in the polity building? So how much can we do to sort of build from the ground up, which is what was happening. So you have all these different pastoral networks that are moving around, but how did one single regime go out to those different areas and say, okay, you've got these networks, how I'm going to bring these together? And how do you then sort of like build up? So we definitely are not working in some sort of scale-free network at all. We are, as was mentioned earlier, in need of being very cognizant of multi-scalar interactions and multi-scalar approaches to think about all the scales at the same time. So if we're going to talk about networks, we talk about nodes and flows, and rather than thinking about all of these, individual elites who are rising up in the creation of these imperial regimes, that they are nodes of wealth, but they're nodes of wealth because wealth moves through them. The material capital is constantly moving through them, even though they don't have these grain stores. They are the ones who decide where physical or material capital goes. This kinds of wealth goes. And it's not necessarily amassed there, but instead these nodes, these individuals or families, are instead seeking to accrue ample social and cultural capital, and therefore increase their capacity for social action. And so a node in this sort of social networks analysis thinking has great centrality, not because of where it sits in any sort of like space, any physical space, but where it sits in the social network. So there are terms, degree centrality, betweenness centrality, closeness centrality, the idea of strength of weak ties, that I think can help us think through some of these concepts about empire that are actually very, very misleading. So very quickly, just a review, degree centrality, now we're talking about one single node, a community, an individual, and how well connected they are, how many different people they're interacting with. That's important, but especially when you're trying to run a massive regime or move wealth around, what very often happens is you'll have this regime injecting itself into networks, placing itself specifically at nodes or creating specific nodes that are more about betweenness centrality and closeness centrality, which is all about who controls the greatest action potential. They might not directly be connected to a bunch of nodes, but all the paths and the movements of wealth and social capital have to go through them. And so they actually are the most impactful. And so that's what you end up having right here. So if we can keep this kind of basic social network in mind to think about these being the sort of the rulers of this massive polity, but they're not always in space there. One of the problems with some of the modes of thinking about empires and large-scale polities is we're always trying to look for the capital. We're trying to look for the metropole, and that's extremely misleading. So in conversations with people, archaeologists are great at borrowing from other disciplines. I had a very nice conversation with a a few graduate students, including the partners of graduate students who research in completely different fields. And one of them was mentioning this idea of synaptic plasticity that he's working on, looking at the brain stuff. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, because now you get this idea of networks aren't just one single graph. Like, there it is. There's the matrix, and it's perfect. Well, there is no spoon. We have to think about these things moving a lot more. And I think that's what concepts like synaptic plasticity allows us to do, is because now we can think about how certain nodes and those vertices between the nodes can get louder or softer in a lot of ways, and are constantly moving. If we go back to the earliest research on archaic polities that I mentioned before, the whole point was that these polities, it's not just the rise and the fall. They're constantly fluctuating. People are constantly moving these pieces around on the go board, so to speak. And so you can also have certain nodes that suddenly disconnect and reconnect here. Now, that's good for the empire, trying to make sure that it's always efficient in the way it moves well for its own benefit. But local communities can also do this as well. They can try and circumvent. If this is, the node where everything has to move through, then maybe they can say, we're going to circumvent the empire and come this way. And so there's always this push and pull, which is the normal thing to think about when you're thinking about these massive regimes, these huge political entities. So what we do have, for the case of the first empire, nomadic empire, or I should say steppe empire of Mongolia, is unfortunately, we don't have a lot of these settlements. There's fantastic research being done, has been done since the late 90s, including a graduate of the University of Michigan, to try and find these campsites of the mobile pastoralists. But that's very slow going. Hopefully, another decade or two, we might have even more data. But what we do have now, if we want to try and look at huge landscapes and try and think of networks, what we do have now is these mortuary sites, which are moorings. If you think about these communities that are not just moving around the landscape, as one completely bounded unit, but they're constantly splitting and coming back and splitting and coming back. They also are fluctuating. Well, at certain points, at these specific moorings, they have increased social propinquity. And so these are probably one of the best things that we can look at. Why are they coming together at this specific site? These cemeteries are specific places in the landscape, and they're always coming back to this point. And for this empire period, what we're seeing is two different kinds of things, and this will come into point in a minute, is you've got the normal kind of like local elite graves, which are these sort of stone donuts on the top. But then you have the emergence of this other massive monumental type of tomb. It's qualitatively and quantitatively extremely different. And this is something that was happening actually not at the beginning of the empire. The development of these kinds of things were in reaction to local communities benefiting from the empire, but then trying to pull away and just become independent. And what they were trying to do is say, okay, only the people of these specific lineages are allowed to make these kinds of tombs. It was an assertion of, we are the people in charge. And even if you have a lot of power, a lot of wealth, you are not in this very exclusive echelon. The one other kind of site is we might call rock art sites, but I want to call these gathering sites. And here I'm actually relying on thinking of a lot of the work by Seb Fallis and other colleagues, Lindsay Montgomery, who've been here doing a lot of amazing work with Comanche rock art. And one of the biggest things that they were talking about is this is not art, you put it up on a panel, people are coming back to see this thing. That these are actually not visual images that are in stone, meant in perpetuity, I guess, like these talks. But these are vestiges of actions that happened, of gatherings that happened. And I think that's a much more healthy way to look at it. So that you have these little signs here, which are in modern literature called the tamga signs. And there's some sort of symbols. This is not a system of writing. These are symbols for clans, lineages, and there's not a whole lot of them when you look at the entire spectrum. There's not a lot of them for the Xiongnu Empire. And that's probably because only a few lineages had this sort of exclusive power in the empire. And so only a few of them would even have a clan name to begin with, much less have some sort of tamga symbol. And even when you look at them altogether, there are little artistic variations, but it's very, very similar, the ones. And so why in the world, if it's just about marking territory, why would you have the same symbol written again and again and again, especially this one here and here? Why would the same symbol be there? It's because it's, again, in reference to all the work that's been done in the Southwest, these are vestiges of these extremely important and powerful ruling lineages coming to these sites constantly. And when they're there, they would put their tanga yet again on this site. And when you look at where these sites are, they are right along the avenues of movement for the flows of goods, especially in areas of the Gobi Altai where you have better pasturage right around these mountains. These are also in specific sites where you're going up through the mountains, these passes to get from one side to the next. They're in very, very strategic spots. So this is just a distribution map of all the cemetery burial sites that we have. The changes in the size of dots are the size of the cemeteries themselves, number of graves there. And what I want to do is look all the way out here. This is the case area that I'm going for. And even though this is your typical map, we call it the political landscape. What I want to emphasize is, even though it's mapped out in space, we should probably be thinking more about the social rather than the spatial matrix itself. And so I want to think about and call it a political matrix, not just a political landscape. So when we go out west, we can see these kinds of things here. And even though in the previous map, you can see here, this is like a square tomb cemetery. And what that means is it's a cemetery that has these big square tombs at it. But we need to start to pull these sites apart. And so what we're looking at here is the sites here. So we've got Square Tomb Cemetery here, and here, and here. They're not the biggest nodes out there. They're not at all. They're very exclusive because they have this like certain type of tomb that's out there. So the idea that even though you might have larger nodes here and down here, that maybe they have more well-established lineage groups, local lineage groups, that they are more well-connected to all the other things going on there. The issue at hand, though, when you're trying to think about this whole region is then connected to an even larger network. Because again, we have to think at all these scales all at the same time. Some tiny little node like this. This is actually a very recently discovered this summer. And it's a cemetery, and I like this as an example too, because it's a cemetery that has these exclusive square tombs, but it's only got like 10 or 20 of them, not many. But then it's got tons and tons, like over 200 of these circle graves, which is very, very opposite to square tomb cemeteries in the heart of the empire, where if you have a square tomb cemetery, these things are massive, like 40 meters on the side. And if you have circle graves at those square tomb cemeteries, they're really tiny, or very often they're just flanking the big square tombs. So they are, any elites in a circle grave is inexorably tied to that person in the square tomb. It sort of reinforces that hierarchy. But when we go out west, what we start to see a lot more of, and this is another cemetery where some colleagues of mine and I dug from 2000, a long time ago, 2006 to 10. What we were finding is you go out here and there's not many of these square tombs at a cemetery, or when they are, there are not many of these so-called circle graves are mere satellites. They're much larger. And when you plot them out, you see that there's some sort of tension going on. This idea that, okay, I'm not allowed to be in a square tomb, but I'm allowed to be in a circle grave, which is like the normal standard ones. And some of the objects that are coming out of these circle graves are immense. And it's almost like this push and pull, this play on, I can be just as powerful, even though I might not have the greatest betweenness centrality and closeness centrality, that everything has to go through me, but I can still hoard as much of this social capital as I possibly can. Or when you think about this like synaptic plasticity, now you have communities that are there that are navigating and negotiating their interactions with these foreign elites who are coming in from central Mongolia and trying to control all the movements that are going on. They're pushing back. 2 minutes, okay. Yes, I did fill it up. Thank you very much. The other thing is that at these sites, when the empire goes in, when we think about social networks, and the interesting thing about these social networks is we think about all the different clusters in a network. And this is where I think the weak ties thing is very, very interesting. Because the idea of the strength of weak ties is that even though you have one little node that seems to not have a lot of activity happening, they don't have a lot of degree centrality going on, that single node, even though it seems pretty silent or pretty meager, is extremely important. It is the strength to the entire network because that little one links it over to something else. So I think that's what's happening with these tiny little elite nodes or elite gatherings way out in the periphery. And they knew the landscape. They understood the social as well as the physical landscape. And so when you go to this famous pass, there's already tons of Bronze Age rock art. People have been coming here for a long time and sort of showing their movements through these things. The imperial elites come in and they push their agenda on top of it so that you have all this imperial scenes of carts and whatever, as well as the tamgas that are in this entire thing. And again, I keep going back to the amazing research done in the Southwest. This is exactly the kind of thing that we were talking about before, where you have this imposition on top of this imperial agenda stuck into the narratives over top of or exploiting what's already there. So to return to this idea of looking at a political landscape and it's all nice and laid out, I think even though you see these square tube cemeteries, and if you think of those as sort of the imperial nodes, they seem to be spread out. But if you can bring them back in and think about them not as being really, really far apart in the spatial distance, but very close in a social distance, especially if you're thinking about now a society where you have extreme individual motility, as well as community mobility, where you can have on horseback, the famous horses just go very, very quickly back and forth. You've increased communication. So all the modern work about social networks analysis, thinking about people getting on their iPhones and whatever, it's not the same thing, but still you can see how movements in specific technologies, in this case, the horse, which increases individual mobility, can suddenly galvanize an entire network where you could spread it across. So maybe someday we can build some more Minecraft models. But thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, so we will go over a little. I apologize for that. So we'll have to keep questions a bit short. And I think we'll just keep people in their place instead of coming up and all this and take a couple questions and then go. Our final speaker of the session is Maria Nieves Cedeño, professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. She's a North American archaeologist whose research focuses mainly on integrating archaeology, ethnohistory, and ethnography into projects designed to fulfill the ethical and legal requirements of cultural preservation and to explicitly address contemporary cultural and social concerns of tribal communities. The intellectual framework that organizes her work emphasizes behavioral and social theory. She notes that this integrative venture is slowly becoming a personal contribution to the profession, to the education of students, and to the Native American communities in which she works. Her early professional activities were motivated by an interest in the study of ceramic technology, population movement, regional interaction, and ethnic co-residence in the American Southwest, but recent years have seen her devoted to understanding traditional land use vis-a-vis community identity and social cohesion. And so throughout her career, she has honed a cultural landscape framework to best capture the breadth and complexity of Native concepts of the world as they inform land use practices. She considers herself now to be an indigenous archaeologist, that is an archaeologist that practices archaeology that explicitly combines non-Western worldviews, which we're going to hear about, and conventional archaeological frameworks, both theoretically and practically. Let me pull up your talk because I believe that you may have adjusted your title slightly, and I don't want to screw that.
No, you have the right title.
Okay. I don't think I have it on my notes though. Okay, cool. Her talk is, and this is where I will screw it up, is entitled Atsok. Thank you. From All Sides, a Caring for Posterity, Ancient Monuments and Collective Action Strategies of Mobile Bison Hunters. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you. And thank you for everything. It's been wonderful to be here. I would like to introduce my co-author, Francois Lanoy. He and I co-direct. Does this work? I think it's off. Wait a second. Is that better? Yeah. Francois and I co-direct the Blackfoot Early Origins program. It's a multi-year, multi-project collaboration with the member tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and this talk is just one of our many, many projects. I would also like to acknowledge the ancient mound builders of the Eastern Woodlands, who for 300 years have inspired and challenged us to be better archaeologists and better humans, and continue to inspiring us. Across North America and elsewhere, monument construction is the earliest form of landscape modification through petroforming or terraforming. It was an enterprise initiated by dispersed mobile hunters who came together as a collective in an effort to harness the power of nature and the supernatural. Regardless of how monuments were composed or to whom they were dedicated, they served the purpose of embedding knowledge in order to chart new social futures. We would like to introduce you to ancient monuments in the Northern Plains, because these monuments capture the enduring significance of social networks among humans and non-human persons, whose material expressions became formalized in permanent stone architecture. For the past 300 years, Euro-American sojourners have regarded the Northern Plains as an empty landscape, populated by placeless mobile bison hunters without major settlements or territories. 20th century archaeologists further characterized these hunters' sociopolitical organization as highly conservative and derivative. Most certainly, bison hunters could not have invented monument construction. They must have copied the idea from the Eastern Woodlands. This assertion still lingers today, although data demonstrates that it is not the case, at least initially. The Northern Plains landscape is petroformed. The Aboriginal Blackfoot territory alone, which is roughly 114,000 square kilometers, contains hundreds of thousands of stone features, many of which cut across the prairie to connect two or more water bodies or various seasonal and elevational locales. A single site can be as large as 16 square kilometers. Often, stone alignments and cairns are associated with storied landforms on the prairie and along the Rocky Mountain front. We consider this to be a monumental landscape, albeit a horizontal one. One of the greatest archaeological challenges we face in the Northern Plains is the inability to apprehend this landscape with the naked eye. Tall grass, flat landforms. Few single features make sense on their own. They are difficult to date, and they must be situated within a much larger set of petroforms and against the regional topography. Although we now have the technology to help us visualize them, something else is needed. A bird's eye view mindset and the willingness to integrate Native American philosophy and narrative into landscape scale frameworks. According to the Blackfoot, for example, stones not only mark significant localities on the landscape, they actually hold everything that is good and powerful in place so that the wind won't blow it away. So petroforms lend fixity to a world characterized by mobility, while at the same time accruing knowledge and experience for future generations. You may wonder where all the requisite stones came from. The Northern Plains are littered with glacial till. The terrain itself is reticulated as a result of glacial activity, with rivers intersected by seasonal streams and lakes, all of which favor the movement of people and bison. It contains highly diverse landforms and water bodies that have been repeatedly inhabited since the terminal Pleistocene. Furthermore, the plains offer year-round stunning views of the night sky. Here, humans, stars, and terrain were in constant communication, which we think played a central role in the origin of the monumental landscape. We need to provide you with a tad of culture history so that we can situate the petroform landscape in time. The Plains Archaic period was ushered, quite literally, by a Big Bang. The eruption of Mount Mazama in Oregon dropped a foot or more of ash across the northwestern plains, killing non-arboreal vegetation and forcing hunters and bison to retreat beyond the ashfall for about up to 400 years. Where did they take refuge is a matter of speculation. It is confounded further by the mysteries of Blackfoot linguistics and genetics. This map shows the distribution of early archaic complexes that pre- and post-date the Mazama eruption. If you juxtapose it over the extent of the ashfall, it is possible to think that some people joined neighbors just to the east of the most affected areas, whereas others might have moved much farther away. Once the grassland recovered, bison hunters returned, and for about 1,500 years, they treaded lightly on the landscape. Approximately 30% of well-dated pre-eruption sites were reoccupied after the ashfall, thus suggesting long-term place persistence, particularly along the Rocky Mountain foothills where large game wintered and so did hunters. An increase in size and frequency of archaic sites postdating the Holocene thermal maximum indicates a modest influx of people at the turn of the 6th millennium before present. Population expansion is associated with the Oxbow projectile point complex, which stretches from the edge of the boreal forest to the central plains. The largest and most important sites, however, concentrate on the northern grassland. Dates for the complex range from 5,500 to as recently as 3,000 calibrated BP, and they are also accompanied by more recent coeval and more recent complexes. Oxbow groups were predominantly bison hunters, although they utilize other game as well as fur bearers. Site assemblages exhibit larger variation the closer they are to the forest edge, but generally contain evidence of hunting and camping in small or large groups, berry picking, stone boiling, and possibly pemmican production for surplus storage. Settlement patterns indicate strategic positioning in promising hunting areas. Use of Knife River flint and obsidian in the manufacture of stone tools points to a larger network of raw material supplies relative to earlier periods. Additionally, two major Oxbow characteristics stand out regionally and interregionally: public monument construction and large cemetery formation in at least one known site. The earliest monument, Majorville Medicine Wheel, is located on a slight rise above the lower Bow River in southern Alberta. It was excavated by James Calder in 1971 and reassessed by the Blackfoot-led Medicine Wheel project in 2016. Our amazing projectile point chronology, aided by a few radiocarbon dates, indicates that construction of Majorville began around 5,500 years ago or maybe earlier, and continue for the next 5,000 years. The term medicine wheel derives from the historic mistranslation of Itapishko, the Blackfoot word for power. Medicine in this context that does not mean remedy for an illness. Medicine wheels are neither portals nor sundials, as some New Agers would like you to believe. Rather, they refer to celebration, commemoration, and ancestor veneration. These monuments are accretional. Over time, people have added stones and offerings to them and continue to do so. I was, in fact, given a stone painted in red ochre by a Blackfoot elder and asked to deposit it in one of their ancient monuments. Majorville might not be the largest monument in the region, but is certainly the oldest known and most complex in construction, as you can see by their numbers. James Calder approached the excavation of Majorville smartly. Rather than laying arbitrary excavation units, he actually peeled part of the central cairn like layers of an onion. This method allowed him to uncover each construction episode and recover diagnostic artifacts and soils from all of them. Calder performed rigorous soil analysis and concluded that soil deposition was not the natural result of dominant aeolian processes, but was likely added to the cairn as pavement for stones. So Majorville is both petroformed and terraformed. Thus far, we cannot be scientifically certain that the wheel was built at the same time as the earliest cairn. Generally, historic monuments in Blackfoot country are either laid out all at once or developed in association to prior tipi rings where important men died. It is not known whether this was the case in the deep past, but if we appeal to Blackfoot star stories, we might shed light into the rationale of Majorville's construction. Star stories contain climatic and environmental clues dating to the Archaic period. For example, the Mazama ashfall and the dry heat of the Holocene thermal maximum. They are the Blackfoot equivalent of Moses tablets, which human culture heroes received directly from the sun. They provide social ordering schemes and prescribe cultural practices that reinforce and protect them from rogue behavior. And as such, they are associated with group ethnogenesis in the Archaic period. According to Blackfoot tradition, Majorville Cairn marks the place where the oldest known culture hero, a woman who married Morning Star, and her son touched the earth. The wheel marks the spider web feather woman used to descend from the sky. And I'm tracking right now a supernova explosion around 6,000 years ago that might actually somehow coincide with this event. Therefore, it is possible that features were built at the same time to commemorate her return. The nearly 3,000 objects recovered from Majorville run the gamut from sacred to mundane. Index objects include pipes, ochre, dinosaur bones, and ammonites, which bison hunters regard as magical objects used in bison calling ceremonies. And by the way, my term index object is not from semiotics. It's actually derives directly from NACRA consultation with Native Americans. While 454 projectile points are archaeologically important for dating the progression of Majorville's construction, from a Native American perspective, points are common offerings because of the ready availability and are red-painted tools. Eyewitness experience tells me that formal offerings to monuments made by Plains religious leaders are perishable. They include food, certain woods, incense plants, tobacco, fur, and feathers. These offerings are meant to decay through time. The vast majority of non-perishable offerings found in a monument such as Majorville likely represent whatever there is in a person's pocket or pouch. Offerings are a means to make a vow to the spirit of the monument or simply to pay respect. A dollar bill, a bandana, or a cigarette are the modern equivalent to an ancient pendant, a bonao, or a projectile point. But these votive practices should not be disregarded as casual affairs. On the contrary, they represent a monument's enduring power to reinforce the laws of society in the minds of the community. Not all Plains monuments are created equal. As estimated, 100 to 200 medicine wheels exist in the Northern Plains, and the number keeps changing as people discover new ones. In the 1980s, John Bromley developed a detailed formal typology of medicine wheels found in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. But from an indigenous perspective, there are only 3 types of medicine wheels: large and roofed performative stone circles for ceremonial and dancing occasions, as Ken Sassaman indicated the other day, commemorative monuments for celestial persons and events, and burials of important male individuals. The spokes built in dead man lodges mark the direction of great deeds performed by human ancestors. Most of these postdate the archaic monuments and are associated with increasing social complexity and territorial organization in the last 1,000 years. So where did the idea of monument building come from? Obviously, it does not simply represent the progression of social inequality among sedentary farming communities, as it was traditionally thought. Were these built to celebrate memorable events or crises, or experienced by a mobile group, Or were they built as a result of an individual's powerful vision? Probably both, because visions are a way of interpreting events that are otherwise inexplicable for Native people. Visions also are very effective instruments of change, of social change, because they act as Trojan horses that disguise the foreign and the new with the traditional and the familiar. This is when Native American philosophical principles come into relief, because they help us understand how monuments help to inform life among mobile hunters, and how do they incorporate human and non-human networks. The Black Fork world is animated by a powerful life source that connects everything and everyone. Humans and non-humans can travel the world through this network, but at the same time, the fluidity that connectedness lends to the world makes it dangerous and uncertain. Naked and alone, humans live under very narrow ideal conditions for survival. So human action is laser focused on acquiring enough knowledge and entering in alliances with non-humans to make the world less dangerous and more predictable. In return, humans observe strict laws of reciprocity. As Robert Wallen noted in 2011, formal ritual systems help to prevent knowledge deterioration and loss among mobile people. In the case of bison hunters, bundling is the practical means to hold power and in knowledge and in objects, so that it can be deployed as needed. Bundling is therefore a formal mnemonic tool and a strategy for ordering chaos in the world. When I first encountered bundling among the Blackfoot, I concentrated on the composition of portable bundles still in use today, because I wanted to change the way we classify archaeological assemblages. My publications in 2008 and 2009, I thought were really on the fringe of anthropology, but I did not worry about it, have taken over and expanded the concept of bundling in the past 10 years. I owe to my colleagues in the Eastern Woodlands the fact that they have expanded the concept to include monuments in order to explain their physical and metaphysical composition. We all have found that honing our ability to integrate Native American principles into archaeology has brought new and substantive information about the engineered landscape. To conclude, we suggest that Majorville Medicine Wheel is a bundle which, for the first time during the Archaic period, articulated a formal, permanent, and highly celebrated presence of celestial persons on Earth, thus materializing their power, their laws, and also their humanity. This formalization is directly associated with the emergence of ancient Blackfoot identity as specialized bison hunters, who navigated the plains and organized their cycles by the position of constellations on the firmament, but who could also build petroforms to hold human, non-human networks in place. Early monuments are thus precursors of a system of strict knowledge scaffolds that eventually came to characterize and enforce increasing organizational complexity among these hunters. I want to leave you with a parting thought. The Blackfoot always say that the past, present, and future are always in the here and now, and monuments encapsulate precisely that. Thank you.
What a finish. I just realized for our live stream viewers, maybe it is best if we go up. We can take a couple questions and then we can dart off to lunch because we want to come back for the grad student session. So if you turn your mics on, I'll just open it up for folks to ask questions. Go ahead.
That was a really great session. It was really interesting and stimulating. I'm going quickly because we have to get to lunch. So The tribal societies I work with in modern northern Albania, they're characterized by an ability to disengage from networks, and we've called this strategic isolationism. And there's certainly periods in prehistory in Albania where there's no good evidence for networks, extra-regional networks especially. The material culture evidence isn't there. And under the influence of network thinking, my colleagues tend to say, well, we can't see it, but they're there. But I wonder, kind of following up on Ben's paper, but a question for all of you, I mean, is it true that networks make us human? I mean, aren't there times where we might not be networked? Or are they in fact there and we just can't see them?
No, you can take it.
So my response to that would be say, sociality is very important to humans, right? There's no such thing as an individual human in terms of, you know, living like a brown bear, interacting simply to mate, for example. So therefore, the social interactions that we form have this network formed to them almost by definition. But indeed, of course, you know, networks are dynamic, right? People choose to chop and change, they're fission fusion systems, people move around. And one of the big challenges in network science is actually capturing that dynamism, right? Because by their very nature, they're static things. We show them in graphs and pictures, but capturing the dynamic nature is much harder mathematically and also graphically. But for exactly these reasons, right? You know, the lack of a network, as Ben was talking to, is very important in time, right? You can, sometimes they're very important, sometimes they're less important, and when to opt in and opt out is, of course, of massive strategic importance, right? Because they don't come for free.
I'll just quickly add that when I made that comment, I was thinking about the fact that the cultural transmission itself is inevitably and necessarily a social network process. And therefore, you know, we would not be the cultural animals that we are without that. But I think the fact that we are inherently social doesn't, there's a scale difference between that and the question of whether or not we happen sometimes to find ourselves in situations that a network is either undesirable at a certain scale or impossible to maintain.
Is this on? Okay. My question is, I guess, primarily for the hunter-gatherer specialists on the panel. So a lot of the basis of some like hunter-gatherer network models is based on contemporary data of hunter-gatherers in, you know, quote-unquote marginal environments. You know, marginal to whom? I guess we can leave that aside for now. But like, how does this? How do these models relate or compare to examples of hunter-gatherers from like more like rich environments? So I work in the eastern woodlands where we have really dramatic kind of like social networks that are regional or even like continent spanning. And I guess it seems like in those rich environments, maybe the logic of, or rather, the costs of maintaining some of these social networks might be greater than their benefits if we're mostly focused on like information exchange related to subsistence risk or things like that. So I guess I'll stop there.
Wow. I'm not sure where to go with that, but it's, you know, I mean, one of the interesting things about an open network and one in which the environment supports high densities, I think, is that you have a choice in how to invest that limited resource of social interaction. The other piece is the small world phenomenon that Marcos was talking about, which is that you don't have to be connected to everybody to be connected across the continent, right? So it's, in one sense, it's a tremendous privilege to be in that kind of environment. So I think, I don't have an answer for you. Maybe somebody else here has some other thoughts, but I would say it's a real privilege in a situation in which those networks are free and they are not structured asymmetrically, that you can have access to information resources at various scales. And not everybody does. So it'd be interesting actually to think about how that differs in a place like the Southeast, at least at times when people are doing particularly well and others when they're not.
I could just add to that a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, this is a big question, right? I mean, how do we, so, you know, we can show these nice patterns in data and, you know, and tell you this nice narrative, linking it together, right? But the question is, obviously, there's a massive amount of diversity out there in the real world about how humans actually interact and how that operates over, you know, deep time, expanses of space. I mean, who knows? And this is the, you know, fascinating question. But the underlying observation is that, you know, whatever's going on, there are these networked-like interactions which move us away from this linear world of sort of pan-mixed populations, and just the system in which we interact with each other as humans and as other people pointing out with the supernatural world. All of that is networked and formalized to some extent. And so how exactly that varies from place to place and time to time is, you know, a fascinating and a deep question, right?
Take maybe one more and then we'll have to call it.
Thanks to all of you for a great session this morning. I just wanted to make it more of a comment than anything. Coming to this as a Maya archaeologist, you know, and hearing about Comanche empires and now steppe empires this morning, I think that that's so wonderful because it's really breaking down a lot of the boundaries of the world that I live in and the literature that I read, and thinking about imperial structures like Aztec and Inca and, you know, of the Americas. So that's been really exciting for me. And then also I just wanted to comment that the presentations by both Michelle and Maria are just such beautiful and rich examples of how collaborative archaeology really takes archaeological interpretation into a new space that is, you know, much deeper, much richer, I think much more profound. And so thank you, both of you, for those presentations. Thank you, the whole panel.
Okay, let's go grab lunch, but first let's have a round of applause for the participants. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for coming.